So we're delighted this morning to be able to welcome Tracy Steffes, who is associate professor at Brown University and is a noted scholar in the history of education. A wonderful book, which I'm very grateful for myself, actually, that you wrote on School, Society, and State a few years ago, and is also working on two new book projects. One is a part of a combination with philosopher Ken Howe, a series that I think is a wonderful one of combining historians and philosophers to talk about current issues, and your issue is school assessment, as I understand. And also looking at sort of the balance between city schools and suburban schools. I guess that's your title, Shifting Fortunes, City Schools and Suburban Schools in Metropolitan Chicago. 1945 to 2000, looking at the roles across urban and suburban boundaries, and again, a more current kind of topic I can't imagine. So, looking forward to that as well. And already early in your career, and already the recipient of numerous grants and awards. So it's really a pleasure to have you here to be able to get your thinking.
Thank you.
So thank you. So. As you know, one of the intents of this effort is to try to bring the perspectives of those who are trying to understand education in the U.S. From a historical perspective, to bring the thoughts and ideas generated by that kind of work to the more general conversation about what's happening in schools and what's happening in history and so forth. So I'm just wondering, just as a place to start, if you have any initial thoughts about why we should be looking at history. Aside from justifying, as I like to say to my students, justifying a lot of tuition I spent on history courses, what do you think historians can bring, or history itself can bring to the conversation?
Yeah. So I think that to really understand issues today, or to understand things around us, we often have to understand how they came to be. And history lets us look at causation, origins, development over time, in a way that I think helps us to better understand issues and problems around us today. So, for example, there's a lot of discussion about the racial achievement gap in education. But I think that if you try and define that problem and think about solutions without understanding the historical roots of racial inequality in education, and the way that those historical roots continue to structure inequalities in education, then you miss a really important part of the problem. I also think that history can provide us some lost discussions or alternatives or roads not taken that are worth revisiting in the light of the present. So I don't think that one can simply take lessons straightforwardly from the past. The context of the past is very different than the context today, but sometimes there are reform efforts or discussions that can generate new ideas today that I think are worth revisiting in the light of our current context. But I think the most important thing that history does is help us to think more critically about the world around us. A lot of times the history is so different that it really shows us the contrast between past and present, really highlights what's new or distinctive about the era that we live in. And I think it helps us to question one of the things we might take for granted in the present. So one of the things I always use for my students as an example is this current conversation about the crisis in education. And it's sort of taken for granted in contemporary discourse that schools are failing and in crisis. But I think that this often takes for granted or assumes that schools were once great and have since failed, that there is some problem that schools have gone downhill. But if you look historically, you'll see that schools have always failed in some ways. And that what's new really is not failure, but that we have much higher expectations for what schools will do, that they'll serve all students to a high level. And we were comfortable with a certain amount of failure in the past. I also think that when we talk about school crisis, a lot of times we're implicitly using the benchmark of international comparisons and test scores. And again, if we think more historically and the contrast between the past and the present, we see that this is a really new way of thinking about the success of schools. And I think it leads us to ask questions about whether this is the best way and what kinds of assumptions we're making when we hold our success of schools in terms of the narrow metrics of test scores and international comparisons.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That sounds like a great argument for history to me. So I want to ask if I can for some examples. Particularly, I've always been intrigued by this the rationale. One of the rationales for history, the utility of history, as discussing roads not taken. I think back to a book that affected me years ago. Tom Bender did, I think, Toward an Urban Vision, I think it was, and it was sort of the visions of urban environments that didn't succeed, that didn't become dominant, and it is a way to sort of recall imaginations that might not be present in the moment and so forth. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if there's anything of that comes to mind when you think about roads not taken from history of education that you think might be worth introducing into the current conversation.
So one of the things that comes to mind immediately for me, it's something I'm interested in my work, is there's been moments where there have been debates about the district system and about local control of school finance. In the early 20th century especially, but I think also around the time of school desegregation and fiscal equalization suits in the late 60s and early 70s. And both were moments where people were wrestling really explicitly with the inequities, the structural inequities that come from using local property tax in districts of vastly unequal wealth and resources, and the implications of that for equity. And in both cases, fundamental reform did not occur for a variety of reasons. And this is a conversation I think that is worth re-examining at the current moment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. So one of the things that you mentioned in terms of finance and local control, it seems that we're, with the push for accountability, some are alleging that we're at this, recently speaking with John Zimmerman, for instance, who argues that this is a radical departure we've had. That we've had this, that we still have this kind of very deep tradition around local control, and that we're seeing a rise of a challenge to that. That, in my mind at least, is also complicated by, it seems, your arguments about this this mixed and the role of the states in a way of kind of connecting to each other in a national but not federal way. So I'm just hoping you can help make sense of how to locate this more recent push toward accountability with a stronger federal role, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think local control is something that has been redefined over the course of the 20th century. It means something very different in the early 20th century and today than it did in the 19th century, when local control was essentially, almost complete community control of schools. So in a number of ways, I think local control has been redefined and circumscribed with the growth of school administrators and professionals in the school, with growing state and federal mandates, with expertise that sort of defines best practices in education and takes away some decision-making from communities. But local control has always been an important component of education, and particularly as a site for implementation of policies throughout most of the 20th century. There's a sort of give and take between higher levels of government and district implementation, and that local buy-in and participation has been seen as an essential element of education reform. I do think Zimmerman's right that in the recent decades, there's been a lot more efforts, not just at the federal level, but it seems like a lot of the accountability provisions don't make way for local experimentation and local ownership of reforms in the same way. There's much more mandates and sort of top-down approaches than I think we've seen in the past, where local districts tended to be a partner and an important, site of innovation and experimentation as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the aspects of local control that has always certainly been a part of its ambiguous legacy has been the issues of local control that have worked very much against integration, that have allowed for local prejudices and biases and interests of all sorts of types to exercise a control that some might see as not necessarily furthering the greater aims of the republic. I'm wondering how you see that playing out. You talked in some ways earlier about one of the utilities of history around this roots that continue into the present. I'm just wondering how you see local control and inequities in the system today.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that there's trade-offs with local control, that part of what's attractive about it is that it's a site for experimentation and innovation, that people often identify more and invest more in local control or things in which they have participation. But the trade-off historically has always been that with more empowerment of districts, you tolerate a great deal of inequalities between districts. So in the early 20th century, for example, when they were very much concerned about this problem of equal educational opportunity, particularly in a context of rural schools, which were the smallest, often poorest school districts, sometimes a single one-room schoolhouse district, at a moment where other districts were modernizing, investing a lot more resources in expanding education. So they're concerned about growing inequalities, particularly between rural and urban schools. And so the solution was often standards, leadership, aid to districts. And this helped districts with local leadership or strong educational support or some resources already to buy into reforms, but it left a lot of other districts behind, that either there wasn't strong enough educational sentiment, there wasn't the right local leadership, or they didn't have enough resources to even make use of the state aid and reforms. So it exacerbated inequalities at the same moment that they were trying to address inequality. And as you mentioned, at the same time, local districts are not always sites of democratic participation. They can be sites of exclusion, of inequality in access for people in the community. It might empower more advantaged people in the community and disempower others. And local control, especially in the desegregation era, was often used as a restriction on, more ambitious desegregation plans. So local control of suburbs asserted to prohibit metropolitan desegregation.
Mm-hmm. So, two direct questions, like I said. One, you in an earlier work, which I know must seem a long time ago, but in an earlier work you talked about particularly highlighting the role that the states played in this on various kinds of regulation, both in terms of, as I understood at least, in terms of their efforts toward more local sites, but also states to states, in terms of this kind of ways in which they emulated, copied, stole from each other back and forth to try to put things together. Tell me, if you will. It seems to me that was one of the great contributions of that was that it highlighted this level that often got missed in the particularly more recent debates. Should we abolish the Department of Education at the federal level or not? And then various local school board elections that get press attention because they're arguing about evolution in the biology textbook or something else. And in between are all these state entities. And I'm wondering what we should know about that, and how do you see them in their current roles? Is there the history around them help us explain what their current roles are about?
Yeah. So, I think that the role of state education departments has changed a lot with the growth of federal aid. So I think in the first half of the 20th century, we moved from states being fairly hands-off to taking a more active role in trying to create more coordinated systems and creating minimum standards. And they worked in partnership and often by incentivizing or delegating things to local districts. So it was a fairly quiet, behind-the-scenes often role that states played. They put themselves as educational leaders who could help districts, provided aids, financial aid, leadership supervision in cooperation with districts. But I think with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the growth of federal aid to education, the role of state departments of education has shifted. They've become more of an intermediary in many cases between federal government and local districts. And with ESEA, there's a lot of money invested in strengthening state departments of education, and particularly in reporting, accounting, and supervising in order to account for federal aid and to audit federal aid. And I think this shifted their role to some extent.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Made them very popular in local districts, I'm sure, with a lot of that recording. Yes. Now, you also talk about, and are working now, I understand, on sort of some of the suburban and urban kinds of migrants, particularly looking at Chicago, and I'm wondering what you're learning.
Yeah, so I'm still early in the project, but I'm interested in a lot of the same things in Chicago that I was interested in the first project. So the relationship between state government and local districts, and the implications for equal educational opportunity. And so this is a period in which there's growing federal aid, and there is massive suburbanization. And so I'm particularly interested in how suburban districts are forming and expanding, if they are particularly advantaged in state and federal policies, because we see a lot of shifting of resources to suburban schools, and today suburban schools are considered the best in the nation, whereas at the beginning of my project in 1945, urban schools were the best in the nation. And so I'm interested in looking at stratification between cities and suburbs, and even within suburbs, as suburbs differentiate from one another. And one of the things that really interests me is not just how schools develop, but how schools are part of communities. And so the role that schools play in developing suburban areas, attracting residents and businesses, how they play into development strategies, and therefore reflect or help to perpetuate larger racial and socioeconomic inequalities across metropolitan areas.
Can you give us an example so far, or how does that? It's intriguing to think about just this overall shift. I think that again, people may not recall that you go from the urban centers being the places to emulate in terms of the schools to current thinking today for degrees justified and unjustified to say that, well, no, what really is happening in the suburbs is really where all the good stuff is happening in education.
Yeah. So one of the things I've looked at so far, I've looked a lot at Chicago public schools, and in the 1950s, they were still celebrated pretty regularly in the Chicago Tribune as terrific schools, as sort of the pride of the city. There was a little recognition that there might be some problems, but it's really surprising in some ways how celebrated the schools were. And by the late 60s, everyone agreed the schools were in terrible crisis, the schools were failing. And so I'm looking at this changing conversation, and particularly conflicts about school desegregation and educational inequalities by race, and how the school board tried to navigate these criticisms while also, and a growing activism by the Black community to protest unequal education in the city, but at the same time was really hampered in the kinds of things they could do by what they saw as the intractable problem of white flight. And this is where what's happening in the metropolitan area and the suburbs really affects city schools in Chicago. That because of residential discrimination, African American families had many fewer residential choices than white families, both within the city, and suburbs were almost fully closed to African American families. And so there's a growing trend, particularly of white middle-class suburbanization, and school officials and city leaders in Chicago are concerned that any moves they make that alienate or upset white parents is going to exacerbate this problem of white flight, and is going to hurt the quality of the schools, particularly as these middle-class families take their resources across the city line into suburbs. And so it really constrains the school reform efforts and conversations and what ultimately school officials do or are able to do. It's interesting because there's some moments where, they form committees, I've read all of these internal memos and committee meetings among board members where they seem to recognize the problem but feel utterly unable to do anything about it because there is a lot of counter-protests from white parents that are deeply opposed to, deeply constrained by the dual housing market and its implications for the city. The other thing I've been looking a lot at, and I don't know what I think of it yet, is some of the school finance policies of the state and the way that things like tax assessment and debt limitation shaped what different districts could do. And depending on tax assessment policies, it seems that some of the suburban districts were able to secure more, by undervaluing property, they were able to secure more state aid. But I'm just sort of still sorting that out.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like a great story that will be told. So when you think about, for instance, one of the issues that obviously is across a lot of this has to do with race and inequality across these various systems. You mentioned earlier that part of the utility of history is to understand some of the roots of current issues.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Sure. So you across the story you're telling, it seems, are these large issues around race and inequality of systems. And you mentioned earlier that part of the utility of history is to understand the roots of these things and the ways in which things seem to continue on. And I'm wondering how what you would offer from a historical record to try to understand some of the current inequalities in the system.
Hello?
Are you
there? Are you still there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
So it's a huge question, but yeah. So and whether that's along lines of suburban-urban, whether that's along regional or other across state lines and so forth, however you might see it, I'm just trying to help populate in people's minds some of the drivers behind inequality.
Hello? You frozen and cut out.
Sorry. And this is my high-speed internet here, so. Is trying to understand some of the drivers, what can history help us understand by way of things that are driving current inequalities, such that if we do mean to address them, that we do them with our eyes open as to what is underneath the current performance.
Yeah, I think in this area, one of the things that history helps us to see, particularly the longer lens of history, is that things that often appear the result of individual choices or unknowable forces or too complicated to understand the roots of, are actually traceable in a lot of cases to public action. So there's been a lot of great historical research about how, for example, residential segregation that appears to be the result of private choices and the workings of the market is actually very strongly underwritten by federal mortgage policies and highway policies, by suburban zoning decisions, urban renewal policies by localities and states, and that all of these structure racial and socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage in ways that continue to have strong and continuing power on our own time, and that we need to recognize the ways in which privilege is built into the very structure of schooling and of housing, which often determines who goes to school where.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So why do we go after schooling rather than housing?
Because it's a lot easier. well, everybody has to go to school according to compulsory attendance laws. We've asserted somewhat of a public responsibility in educating people and enforcing that they do. Schools are one of the few places where everybody comes together. So it makes them appealing sites for trying to change. And, they deal with kids, and it's a very optimistic idea that if we can change schools, we can shape the future through children and through education as a project. I also think it's a cop-out that rather than address more structural issues with the labor market, with housing discrimination, with more systemic forms of discrimination, we seem to think that we can target it only at schools and frame it entirely as an educational problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This in sort of the context of another longer term trend that you also documented in your work, and I just think it's an interesting one for people to recall, which is the increasing compulsion from the state upon families and individuals. So we don't like to think about it that way. We put it in terms of increased education levels, and yet I'm wondering whether there's anything in the current, particularly given long roots, I suspect, of this just leave me alone kind of American sense that if you see any remnants of that or evidence of that in current debates, I guess I think of also homeschooling, I think of the resistances to this are we reaching a cultural limit of state compulsions? Are we reflecting that in some of what we hear around education?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting about compulsion is that it also carries with it a claim about public responsibility. So, with compelling children to go to school, it's rooted in the idea that children's education is important for society, that there's a public interest in the education of every child. And that's one of the things that strikes me about the early 20th century is the strong language of social responsibility and the civic purposes of education. And I think that's something that has shifted quite a bit in the last few decades. We tend to talk a lot more about schooling as an individual and an instrumental good. It's going to help my kid get a good job, or it's going to help them succeed in life, and a lot less about the public purposes and sort of civic and social good of educating all children. And at the same time, we've seen homeschooling movements, efforts to peel back compulsory attendance to some extent. We have periodic debates now about whether compulsory attendance is even a good thing. But essentially, it should be up to individual parents and the individual good of the child. And so I think what's missing a lot of times from that language is the stronger sense of what the public good is, or the public necessity of educating children, and that the public has an interest in the kind and quality of education that children receive. It's not simply of interest to that individual child or family.
And why do you think that has shifted?
I think it has to do with the rights revolution and changes in thinking about individual rights. I think it has to do with changes in political culture, particularly growing conservatism and idealization of the market and some market assumptions. And a lot of this is just more individualistic, hyper-individualistic, actually, in its framing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And part of it might be along with market thinking, growing distrust of the welfare state and of big public policies. We've seen attacks on different kinds of social welfare programs, and education is a social welfare program. It's just not one that we've tended to talk about in those terms.
And that to me is also a very interesting area, this notion of education as social welfare, particularly in the U.S., where in some ways it seems like it was the option to not go the social welfare route that was going in other places. Could you help us understand that phenomenon?
Yeah, this is one of the things I talk about in my book, that at the moment where a lot of other European nations are investing really heavily in what we think of as traditional social welfare policies, more redistributionist policies, labor protection, social safety network, the United States invested very heavily in education. And in some ways, it's an alternative to those more redistributionist policies. But in other ways, education itself is a social welfare project. A lot of the logic behind it in the early 20th century was that it was going to help individuals navigate the risks and uncertainty of the modernizing economy. It's just one that doesn't provide, that puts a lot more onus and responsibility on the individual. The idea that if we can equip individuals through education, through a generous public investment in education, then this is going to help them succeed and navigate the changing economy. Whereas in other places, there was much more concern with addressing some of the shortcomings and inequalities of capitalism. I'm sorry, I got distracted in the middle of that.
No, fine. Yeah, I mean, I think that shift is, or that distinction, I think, is one of these large ones that I find has been eye-opening for students to try to wrestle out the consequences of sort of leading on the edge of public schooling earlier than so many other nations. And as a part of a civic project too. I mean, the other thing being that it was leading from a base of high literacy rates, so it just seems an unusual setting. And yet, I think, as you've corrected the record in some ways, where we always thought of that as just being behind the Europeans in terms of social welfare policies, rather than seeing it as a different approach to social welfare policies in some ways. So I see our time getting shorter, and I want to ask you about specifically about your choice around Chicago, which always seems to me a fascinating city. I confess, as a child, I lived outside of one of the suburbs of Chicago at one point, so there's a personal interest. But also in more recent ed policy, certainly Chicago, both from the Bennett's comment about having the worst schools, I think, in the country. Was that the
yes.
to then having its school head become the Secretary of Education?
Although, to be fair, a lot of cities could have vied for that title at the same time.
It was a competitive market at that point, yeah. So tell me tell me if you could tell me about some allures of Chicago. Are there lessons of Chicago? Are there things that you're particularly attracted to on it?
Yeah, I'm attracted to Chicago both because I think it's representative in a lot of ways of patterns of other large metropolitan areas in terms of its residential segregation, the diversity of its suburbs. Some were very old, still already by the time of World War II. Others grew up from farmland in the 70s and 80s. and this is typical not just of northeastern or midwestern cities, but of a number of cities across the nation in terms of its fragmentation and segregation. But it's also a particularly interesting site because of the educational innovations there, particularly at the end of the 20th century. And I'm also really interested because Chicago is not just a story of urban decline the way that that some cities are, like my native Detroit. There's been a lot of gentrification in the city in recent decades, and there's a lot of diversity in the suburbs, some of which are booming and some of which are struggling. And so I'm also interested in thinking about and wrestling with those trends, particularly the uneven gentrification and its impact on the schools.
Mm-hmm. In terms of more recent movements back into the city, you're thinking?
Right. Yeah. Investment in and movement back into the city of middle-class whites and in particular a class of young professionals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And yet it somewhat echoes the theme you mentioned earlier about development strategies. Is this an urban counter to suburban tactics as well?
Yeah, although the impact on the schools has not been very great. So, this is one of the things that interests me is the sort of mismatch between the population in some places and the schools. The schools remain overwhelmingly places of concentrated poverty and high minority enrollment. So these families that are moving back are by and large not sending their kids to public schools. And so, I'm definitely interested in the role or the place of schools in the story. And it seems like in the city, at least, schools, in the suburbs, schools are often an attraction and part of development strategies, but in some ways the Chicago public school system's been an obstacle to some of this development or gentrification and redevelopment in the city.
Are you seeing any role for charters in that mix?
I haven't gotten that far.
Gotcha.
So far my research has been up through the 80s, and charters really don't come on the scene until the 90s. But I suspect they're going to be an important part of the story.
Good.
Charters are part of the public school system, as you know, and I'm definitely interested in seeing how that plays out. I have some guesses, but nothing concrete right now.
Good. I'm selfishly trying to get some gleanings from work that I'm doing after the period that you're looking at, actually. So I'm eager to find out the roots before I get into that, because I do think it's an interesting phenomenon.
Well, the first schools of choice were magnet schools, and those were related to desegregation efforts in the 70s. Yeah. But charter schools are a slightly different animal, and those come later.
Yeah. I was intrigued recently to see the chart that done a couple of years ago, I guess, by Gary Orfield's project on comparing magnet and charter funding from the federal government. And the relatively flat funding of magnets since their initial funding, I think, in '84, in constant dollars, but the role of charter funding just taking off in the '90s, and now I think at triple the rate at a federal subsidy, at least for that sector.
And that's federal subsidies, not private, because I know the charters are often able to leverage private donations.
Well, this is just right. This is just looking at the federal funding of it, and so it's independent of the picture of wider philanthropic and other kinds of contributions. So it's a very interesting picture of, as you're saying earlier, some of the public decisions and policy decisions affecting these. It's not necessarily some quote unquote natural market playing out in these things. It seems a repeating theme here. It seems that we actually have intention and actions and agency in the world that we can track in history.
Well, and that's one of the things history can do, right, is to bring those things to the surface because, we should be asking questions about these things and not seeing them as natural developments and that are therefore can't be changed. If it's a result of public policies and the results are not good, we can make other decisions.
Yeah. Well, that's a very empowering note to conclude. I want to thank you very much for your because I know you're in the midst of just about heading out to travel, so I very much appreciate your taking time to chat, and hope you have safe travels. Any concluding remarks that you would want to make, or?
Um, no, history is important.
Well, and you've shown us. And
Like I said, I think the best thing history does is help us to ask better questions.
excellent, excellent. Well, wonderful. And you've helped us do that today. So thank you very much. Safe travels, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. Bye-bye.
Bye.